Every difficult day leaves behind something that rarely ends when the day itself is over. The conversation is finished. The drive home is quiet. The notifications stop. Still, one careless sentence keeps returning, as though it was spoken only moments ago. You replay what happened, search for the response you wish you had given, and carry someone else's behavior into moments they were never part of. A few brief minutes begin shaping an entire evening, then another day, sometimes much longer. It becomes so familiar that you hardly notice how much of your inner life is being governed by experiences that have already passed. At first, the explanation seems obvious. Someone crossed a line. Someone acted unfairly. Their choices disturbed your peace. But if that were the whole story, the same event would affect everyone in the same way. It never does. One person brushes off an insult that another remembers for years. One sees rejection as proof of failure, while someone else sees the same moment as a change in direction. The world presented the same circumstance. What changed was the meaning each mind gave it. Hidden inside that difference is something remarkably easy to overlook, because blaming the world feels far more natural than examining the quiet interpretations shaping every emotional reaction. Long before psychology began exploring the relationship between thought and emotion, the Stoics were studying that invisible space between what happens and what follows within the mind. The first feeling may arrive without permission, but what grows from it depends on something far deeper than circumstance. Once that realization begins taking root, anger no longer appears as something placed inside you by other people. It becomes something your own interpretations have been quietly sustaining, and that discovery changes far more than your emotions. It changes the way you experience reality itself. Think about the last time someone ruined your mood. Maybe it was a careless comment made in passing, a look that felt dismissive, a message left unanswered, or criticism that stayed with you long after the conversation had ended. The strange part is that the event itself often lasts only a few moments. A sentence is spoken, a decision is made, someone walks away, and life continues moving forward exactly as it always has. Yet your mind refuses to move with it. Hours later, while everything around you has changed, that single moment remains frozen. You replay it while making dinner, while driving home, while trying to fall asleep. New responses appear that never came to you in the moment. Different versions of the conversation unfold in your imagination, each one ending with the words you wish you had said. Without noticing it, you continue participating in an interaction that no longer exists anywhere except inside your own thoughts. The other person may already be focused on something completely different, unaware that they are still occupying space in your mind. What feels like a reaction to them has quietly become a conversation with yourself. This is where the misunderstanding begins. It seems completely reasonable to believe that another person's behavior created the anger, because the emotion appeared immediately after the event. Cause and effect feel obvious. Someone acted unfairly, so naturally you became upset. Someone ignored your effort, so disappointment followed. Someone questioned your abilities, so frustration emerged. The sequence feels so convincing that very few people ever stop to examine it more closely. They assume the emotion traveled directly from the outside world into their inner one, leaving no room for anything in between. But if that explanation were complete, everyone would experience the same emotional response to the same event. They don't. One person laughs at an insult that deeply wounds someone else. Another receives criticism with curiosity, while someone beside them hears only rejection. Two people lose the same opportunity, yet one sees defeat, while the other sees unexpected freedom. The event remains unchanged. The difference lies somewhere else, somewhere less visible than the circumstances themselves. The Stoics spent centuries studying that invisible space because they understood that it quietly governs nearly every emotional experience. They did not deny that difficult events happen or pretend that pain can simply be ignored. They observed something much simpler and at the same time much more unsettling. Between what happens and what you feel, the mind is constantly assigning meaning. It does this so quickly that the process becomes almost impossible to notice. A comment becomes disrespect. Silence becomes rejection. Delay becomes betrayal. Failure becomes proof that you are not enough. As Epictetus observed, people are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of them. The external event arrives first, but the emotional weight is added by interpretation. That does not mean your emotions are fake or that they should be dismissed. They are real experiences. What deserves closer attention is the quiet process that shaped them before you were even aware it had begun. Once you begin seeing this, anger no longer appears as an unavoidable consequence of life. It begins looking more like a habit of interpretation that has been practiced so often it now feels automatic. Automatic reactions rarely announce themselves. They do not ask for permission before taking over your thoughts. Instead, they arrive wearing the disguise of certainty. Your mind tells you that your conclusion is simply reality, not realizing it has already filled in countless details that were never actually confirmed. A delayed reply suddenly becomes evidence that someone no longer values you. A brief expression on another person's face becomes proof of judgment. Someone forgetting to acknowledge your effort becomes intentional disrespect. Very little of this comes from direct observation. Most of it comes from assumptions quietly completing unfinished stories. The human mind dislikes uncertainty. Faced with incomplete information, it naturally begins creating explanations. Those explanations often feel so convincing that questioning them seems unnecessary. Yet many emotional storms begin with conclusions that were never true to begin with. That question is uncomfortable because it quietly redirects responsibility inward. It is far easier to spend years believing that difficult people are the source of your emotional instability than to recognize how often your own interpretations are shaping the experience. This realization is not about blame. The Stoics were never interested in making people feel guilty for experiencing emotion. Their goal was freedom. Freedom becomes possible only when you recognize where your influence actually begins. If every emotion is entirely created by someone else's behavior, then peace will always remain dependent upon circumstances beyond your control. You will need kinder people, fairer treatment, better timing, and fewer disappointments before your inner world can finally settle. That is an exhausting way to live, because life rarely agrees to those conditions. If this way of looking at life resonates with you, consider subscribing. This place is built for people who want to understand themselves more deeply, think more clearly, and approach life with greater wisdom. A different possibility begins opening once you recognize that interpretation stands between events and emotions. Suddenly, the mind is no longer a passive victim of circumstances. It becomes an active participant in every emotional experience. That realization does not erase anger overnight or prevent disappointment from appearing. It simply reveals that your inner world is more flexible than you once believed. The stories your mind creates can be questioned. The assumptions can be examined. The conclusions can be slowed down before they become emotional certainty. Little by little, you begin responding less to imagined meanings and more to reality itself. That quiet shift marks the beginning of genuine emotional mastery, not because the world has become easier, but because you have finally started seeing the difference between what happened and what your mind has been telling you about it. The difficulty is not in accepting that interpretation shapes emotion. The difficulty is recognizing your own interpretation while it is happening. The mind works with remarkable speed. Before you consciously understand what occurred, it has already organized the experience into a story that feels complete. Someone interrupts you, and your thoughts immediately whisper that they do not respect you. A message goes unanswered, and within minutes the silence begins transforming into rejection. Plans change unexpectedly, and disappointment quietly becomes evidence that life is working against you. These conclusions arrive so naturally that they rarely feel like opinions. They feel like facts. That is why they become so difficult to challenge. Once an interpretation disguises itself as reality, the emotion attached to it becomes equally convincing. Anger no longer feels like one possible response. It feels like the only reasonable response available. Life constantly demonstrates how unreliable those first conclusions can be. Think about two people receiving the exact same criticism at work. One spends the rest of the week questioning every decision they make, replaying the conversation until confidence slowly disappears. The other listens carefully, thanks the person for the feedback, adjusts what needs improving, and continues moving forward without carrying resentment into the next day. Nothing about the criticism changed. The words were identical. The situation remained the same. The only difference existed inside the minds of the two people experiencing it. One interpreted the criticism as a judgment of personal worth. The other interpreted it as useful information. The emotional outcome followed the interpretation rather than the event itself. This happens so often that it becomes impossible to ignore once you begin paying attention. Everywhere you look, circumstances remain surprisingly similar, while inner experiences vary dramatically. This realization sits at the heart of Stoic practice. Before trying to control behavior, the Stoics trained themselves to observe the movement of thought. They understood that reacting without examining perception is like trying to steer a ship without first knowing where the current is taking you. Observation comes first, because action built upon confusion rarely produces wisdom. Instead of becoming absorbed by the behavior of other people, they became curious about the quiet judgments forming inside themselves. Why did those words create frustration? Why did that delay feel unbearable? Why did a small inconvenience suddenly become overwhelming? These questions were never intended to encourage endless analysis. They existed to slow the automatic process just enough for awareness to enter. In that brief pause, emotion loses part of its momentum, and reason finally has an opportunity to participate. Beneath almost every strong emotional reaction lies something older than the event itself. A criticism may awaken the fear of never being good enough. Disrespect may expose a deep desire for approval. Rejection often reveals expectations that were never questioned in the first place. The surface emotion appears to concern today's situation, but its roots frequently reach much further back. That is why similar experiences continue producing similar reactions throughout life. Different people, different conversations, different places, yet somehow the emotional pattern remains familiar. Without realizing it, the mind keeps returning to the same hidden beliefs and asking the world to confirm them. Then, when reality cooperates, those beliefs grow stronger. The reaction feels justified because it has been repeated so many times that it becomes part of identity rather than simply another mental habit. Reacting requires very little effort. Reflection demands something far more difficult. It asks you to remain present long enough to notice your own thinking before becoming completely identified with it. This is uncomfortable because it removes the certainty that anger often provides. It is much easier to conclude that another person is entirely responsible for your emotional state than to admit that your own expectations quietly shaped the experience. Expectations often remain invisible precisely because they seem reasonable. You expect honesty, appreciation, fairness, punctuality, understanding, respect. None of these desires are inherently wrong. Problems begin when the mind quietly transforms them into demands that reality must satisfy. As Seneca observed, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. The moment life fails to meet those demands, frustration appears almost automatically. What seemed like anger toward another person often began as resistance to reality, refusing to follow an internal script. Over time, this way of observing begins changing ordinary moments that once seemed insignificant. Waiting in traffic becomes an opportunity to notice impatience before it grows into irritation. An uncomfortable conversation becomes a chance to recognize defensiveness instead of automatically feeding it. A forgotten promise becomes an invitation to examine disappointment without immediately assigning blame. None of these situations become pleasant overnight, but they stop feeling as though they possess unlimited power over your inner world. Awareness creates a small amount of distance between the event and your response. That distance may appear almost invisible, yet it is where freedom quietly begins. The stronger your ability to notice the judgments beneath your emotions, the weaker those emotions become at convincing you they represent absolute truth. Gradually, something unexpected happens. Anger starts losing the certainty it once carried. It still appears because you are human, but it no longer arrives wearing the disguise of unquestionable reality. Instead, it becomes information pointing toward something deeper inside the mind, an expectation, a fear, an attachment, a belief that has gone unexamined for far too long. Once you begin seeing emotional reactions in this way, difficult people stop being your greatest teachers by accident alone. They become mirrors revealing the hidden assumptions that have quietly directed your life for years. That realization marks the beginning of genuine self-mastery, because lasting peace has never depended solely on changing the world around you. It begins with understanding the invisible world, interpreting it. Emotional mastery is often misunderstood because it is judged from the outside instead of experienced from within. A calm person is frequently assumed to be someone who no longer feels deeply. Someone who remains composed during conflict is sometimes described as detached, indifferent, or emotionally distant. This misunderstanding has followed Stoicism for centuries. Many people picture the Stoics as individuals who hardened themselves until nothing could affect them anymore, as though wisdom required becoming less human. That image is persuasive because it appears strong, but it completely misses the point. The Stoics never sought to eliminate emotion. They sought to prevent emotion from becoming the unquestioned ruler of their decisions. They knew disappointment would still arrive, grief would still visit, fear would still appear without invitation. Anger itself was never treated as proof of failure. The real question was always what happened after the emotion appeared. Did it immediately seize control of thought, speech, and action, or did reason quietly step forward before the emotion decided everything on its own? Unfortunately, very few people notice where one ends and the other begins. The transition happens so quickly that emotion feels inseparable from identity. Someone speaks harshly, and within seconds the mind begins constructing arguments, rehearsing retaliation, searching for proof that the other person was wrong. What started as a brief emotional impulse rapidly becomes an entire mental world built around protecting the ego. Hours may pass before the body begins calming down, yet the mind continues feeding the experience with fresh interpretations, imagined conversations, and repeated justifications. The original event may have lasted 30 seconds, but the emotional reaction quietly extends it into an entire day. This is how temporary emotions become lasting states of mind, not because the emotion itself remains that long, but because thought continues renewing it again and again. There is, however, a space so small that it often goes unnoticed. It exists between the first emotional impulse and the action that follows. It may last only a second, sometimes less. Yet within that brief pause lies one of the greatest forms of freedom available to any human being. Most people never experience it because life has trained them to move immediately from feeling to reacting. Someone offends them, and words leave their mouth before awareness has fully arrived. Something goes wrong, and frustration immediately dictates behavior. The habit becomes so automatic that it feels impossible to interrupt. But every person who has ever responded with patience instead of retaliation has entered that space, even if only for a moment. They paused long enough for another possibility to appear. This practice grows stronger through ordinary moments rather than extraordinary ones. It develops while standing in long lines, sitting in traffic, receiving unexpected criticism, or dealing with everyday disappointments that seem too small to matter. These situations become training grounds because they reveal how quickly the mind wants to surrender its balance. Each inconvenience offers another opportunity to notice the first emotional movement without immediately obeying it. At first, the pause feels awkward because the habit of instant reaction has been reinforced for years. Gradually, it becomes more familiar. The space between impulse and response begins expanding almost without effort. What once felt impossible slowly becomes natural. Calm stops feeling like something forced and starts becoming something chosen. An unexpected change follows. Emotions themselves become easier to understand because they are no longer racing past unnoticed. Anger begins revealing disappointment beneath it. Anxiety exposes uncertainty. Defensiveness points toward insecurity. Instead of treating emotions as enemies that must be defeated, you begin recognizing them as signals asking for attention without demanding obedience. This shift creates compassion without sacrificing discipline. You stop judging yourself simply for feeling deeply while also refusing to let those feelings dictate your character. The emotional experience remains fully human, yet your relationship with it becomes fundamentally different. You are no longer carried wherever each passing emotion decides to go. Over time, people notice your steadiness without necessarily understanding where it comes from. They assume you are naturally patient or unusually calm, unaware that what they see is the result of countless invisible decisions made inside those quiet pauses. They never witness the impulses you chose not to follow, the harsh words you allowed to dissolve before speaking them, or the interpretations you questioned before accepting them as truth. Real emotional mastery has always been built there, inside moments too small for anyone else to notice. It is not measured by the absence of feeling, but by the growing ability to remain present long enough for wisdom to speak before emotion claims the final word. Notice how convincing anger feels in the moment it appears. It arrives with absolute certainty, insisting that immediate action is the only reasonable response. It tells you that silence would be weakness, patience would be surrender, and restraint would somehow diminish your dignity. Under its influence, speaking quickly begins to feel courageous, interrupting feels justified, and retaliation seems like proof that you respect yourself. The strange part is that anger almost always presents itself as a protector. It claims to defend your values, your reputation, your time, or your sense of fairness. Because its intentions appear noble, very few people stop to question the methods it recommends. They assume that because the emotion feels powerful, the actions it inspires must also be powerful. Only later, when the intensity fades, does a different picture begin to emerge. Think back to moments when emotions made decisions before reason had the chance to participate. A conversation that could have ended peacefully suddenly became an argument that lasted for days. A relationship slowly weakened because harsh words spoken in a few emotional seconds continued echoing long afterward. Opportunities disappeared because pride refused to tolerate criticism. Even when the other person was clearly wrong, the reaction often created consequences that extended far beyond the original problem. This is one of anger's quiet deceptions. It narrows attention until winning the immediate moment feels more important than protecting the future. While consumed by emotion, the only goal becomes proving a point, defending an identity, or forcing someone else to understand. Rarely does the mind ask what tomorrow will look like after today's reaction has finished unfolding. That is why anger creates such a convincing illusion of control. Raising your voice feels decisive. Delivering the perfect comeback creates the impression of strength. Refusing to let something go appears fearless. For a brief period, it almost feels as though you have reclaimed authority over the situation. Yet, if you examine what actually happened, something entirely different becomes visible. The emotion dictated your words. It determined your tone. It controlled the pace of your thinking and the direction of your attention. What appeared to be personal power was often the surrender of personal freedom. The louder anger speaks inside the mind, the smaller your ability becomes to choose another response. Control never truly belonged to you during those moments. It belonged to the emotion convincing you that it was acting on your behalf. This contradiction fascinated the Stoics because they understood that genuine strength cannot exist without self-command. A person capable of dominating an argument while remaining unable to govern their own thoughts has not achieved mastery. They have simply exchanged one form of weakness for another. Winning against another person means very little if the cost is losing authority over your own mind. This becomes especially clear when you observe how differently calm and anger influence judgment. Anger rushes toward conclusions because certainty feels satisfying. Calm remains willing to gather more information before deciding. Anger searches for evidence that confirms its story. Calm remains open to discovering that the first interpretation may have been incomplete. Anger demands immediate action because waiting feels unbearable. Calm understands that time often reveals what emotional urgency hides. As Aristotle observed, it is easy to become angry, but to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, is not easy. Neither state changes external reality, yet each creates an entirely different relationship with it. One narrows perception until only threat remains visible. The other expands perception until complexity returns. Suddenly, another person's actions are no longer reduced to simple categories of enemy or ally, respect or disrespect, victory or defeat. Reality becomes more nuanced, and wiser decisions naturally follow. This does not mean calm people avoid confrontation or accept mistreatment without response. Stoicism has never been about passive acceptance. It has always been about deliberate action. There are moments when firm boundaries must be established, difficult conversations must happen, and injustice must be challenged directly. The difference lies in the source of those actions. A response guided by anger usually seeks emotional relief before anything else. A response guided by clarity seeks resolution. One attempts to discharge uncomfortable feelings as quickly as possible. The other attempts to solve the actual problem. From the outside, the two responses may appear similar because both can involve speaking firmly or refusing unacceptable behavior. Internally, however, they are completely different experiences. One is driven by impulse. The other is guided by intention. Few people realize how exhausting constant emotional reactivity becomes over time. Every disagreement consumes energy long after it ends. Every imagined insult requires mental attention. Every unnecessary argument leaves behind emotional residue that quietly follows you into conversations that had nothing to do with the original conflict. Eventually, the mind becomes conditioned to expect offense even where none exists. Ordinary situations begin triggering defensive reactions because vigilance has become a habit. Peace grows increasingly difficult to experience, not because life has become harsher, but because the nervous system has learned to remain prepared for battles that often never arrive. This is one of the hidden costs of uncontrolled anger. It rarely limits itself to isolated moments. It gradually reshapes your entire relationship with the world. The Stoics understood that preserving inner stability required protecting attention as carefully as others protect possessions. Once your attention becomes completely captured by another person's behavior, your inner freedom quietly begins slipping away. They may not control your circumstances, but they begin influencing your thoughts, your emotions, and eventually your choices. This is why refusing unnecessary provocation is not an act of avoidance. It is an act of self-respect. You are choosing not to allow another person's temporary behavior to become the permanent architect of your internal state. That decision often feels invisible because it happens entirely within the mind, yet it represents one of the strongest forms of discipline a person can develop. Gradually, something remarkable begins changing. Situations that once demanded immediate emotional reactions lose much of their urgency. You notice criticism without instantly becoming defensive. You encounter disrespect without feeling compelled to prove your worth. You recognize anger arising inside you without assuming it deserves obedience. That does not make you indifferent. It makes you increasingly difficult to manipulate. The person standing before you still possesses opinions, moods, and unpredictable behavior, but none of those things automatically determine your own. In that quiet independence, real strength finally reveals itself. It was never hidden inside louder words, sharper arguments, or quicker retaliation. It was waiting in the ability to remain fully responsible for your own mind, regardless of what another person chose to bring into the moment. Steadiness rarely begins with mastering difficult people. It begins with becoming less of a stranger to yourself. That may sound simple, yet it is one of the hardest forms of work because the mind naturally prefers looking outward instead of inward. It is easier to analyze someone else's flaws than to examine the invisible patterns shaping your own reactions. When a conversation leaves you frustrated, attention immediately moves toward what the other person said or failed to say. When disappointment appears, the circumstances seem like the obvious cause. Rarely does the mind pause long enough to ask why this particular event carried so much emotional weight. The answer is often hidden beneath the surface, quietly influencing your responses long before the situation unfolded. Until those hidden influences become visible, they continue directing your emotional life without ever introducing themselves. This is why the same emotional patterns seem to repeat with different people. One difficult relationship ends, only for another one to begin with surprisingly familiar dynamics. A criticism from one person hurts in almost exactly the same way criticism from someone years earlier once did. Rejection continues producing the same internal collapse, regardless of who delivers it. Disrespect consistently awakens the same urge to defend yourself. It is tempting to believe life simply keeps sending the wrong people into your path, but repetition often points somewhere deeper. The people change, the situations change, the emotional pattern remains. That consistency suggests something inside the mind has been waiting to react in the same familiar way. Life simply continues providing opportunities for it to reveal itself. Many of these hidden patterns begin forming long before we are aware they exist. A child who receives approval only through achievement may quietly grow into an adult who believes personal worth depends on constant success. Someone repeatedly ignored may develop a powerful sensitivity to feeling overlooked. Another person who experienced frequent criticism may begin interpreting ordinary feedback as personal rejection. None of these beliefs announce themselves openly. They settle beneath awareness and slowly become part of how reality is interpreted. Years later, a simple conversation activates emotions that seem far larger than the situation itself. The present moment appears responsible, but in truth it has awakened something much older. This is why certain experiences feel surprisingly intense, while others pass without much difficulty. The emotion is often connected less to what happened today than to what has remained unresolved for years. The Stoics encouraged careful observation because they understood that awareness weakens unconscious habits. A recurring emotional reaction should never be viewed merely as something to eliminate. It should first be understood. Strong emotions often function like signals pointing toward unfinished work inside the mind. Anger may reveal a deep attachment to control. Anxiety may expose uncertainty that has been resisted rather than accepted. Jealousy may uncover comparisons that quietly define personal value. Defensiveness often points toward insecurity waiting to be acknowledged. These discoveries are rarely comfortable because they challenge the image we prefer to hold of ourselves. Still, discomfort created by honest reflection is very different from the suffering created by unconscious repetition. One leads toward freedom, the other quietly reinforces the same emotional cycle again and again. This changes the purpose of difficult encounters. Instead of viewing them only as obstacles interrupting your peace, they begin functioning as mirrors, revealing where your peace remains dependent upon external conditions. A disrespectful comment may expose how deeply you still seek approval. A broken promise may reveal how tightly you cling to expectations that others should behave according to your standards. A failure may uncover an identity built entirely around success. The external event becomes less important than the internal response it uncovers. That response contains valuable information because it reveals where your attention should actually be directed. Without those moments, many hidden attachments would remain invisible. Comfort has a way of concealing weaknesses that difficulty immediately brings into the light. Gradually, blame begins losing its appeal. Blaming others may provide temporary emotional relief, but it rarely produces lasting change because it leaves your inner patterns untouched. The same emotional reactions quietly wait beneath the surface until another situation activates them once again. Self-observation creates a completely different path. Instead of searching for someone else to change, you become curious about the beliefs quietly directing your interpretations. Why does approval feel so necessary? Why does disagreement immediately feel personal? Why does uncertainty create such powerful discomfort? These questions are not meant to encourage endless self-analysis. They exist because understanding weakens automatic reactions. What remains unconscious controls behavior. What becomes conscious can finally be examined with honesty instead of fear. This process also requires patience because deeply rooted habits rarely disappear after a single insight. The mind naturally returns to familiar interpretations, especially those repeated for many years. You may recognize an attachment today and still react from it tomorrow. That does not mean progress has stopped. Awareness itself changes the experience. Reactions that once happened completely unnoticed begin revealing themselves sooner. The emotional storm still appears, but it no longer feels entirely mysterious. Little by little, the distance between awareness and reaction grows. The patterns lose some of their authority simply because they are no longer operating in complete darkness. Each moment of recognition quietly weakens the habit, even when the change feels almost too small to notice. Eventually, the world around you begins looking different without actually becoming different. Difficult people still exist. Criticism still arrives. Disappointments continue appearing without warning. The difference is that each encounter now offers something more valuable than immediate emotional satisfaction. It offers understanding. Every challenge becomes another opportunity to notice where attachment still exists, where expectations remain rigid, and where your peace continues depending on conditions outside yourself. That shift changes the entire purpose of adversity. Instead of seeing life as a series of interruptions preventing inner calm, you begin recognizing that many of those interruptions have quietly been inviting you toward deeper self-knowledge all along. Gradually, something begins changing in ways that are almost too subtle to notice at first. The situations themselves remain remarkably familiar. Someone interrupts you before you finish speaking. A promise is broken. A stranger behaves rudely for no apparent reason. A colleague takes credit for your work. Someone misunderstands your intentions despite your best efforts to explain them. Life continues presenting the same challenges it always has. The difference appears somewhere much quieter. The emotional storm that once followed these moments no longer arrives with the same force. The impulse to defend yourself still exists, but it no longer feels irresistible. Frustration still knocks at the door, yet it is no longer welcomed inside without question. Instead of being swept away by the first emotional wave, you begin noticing it as it rises. That single change alters far more than it first appears. The first signs of progress rarely feel dramatic. They often reveal themselves through moments that seem almost ordinary. You catch yourself taking one slow breath before responding instead of speaking immediately. You notice irritation forming without allowing it to dictate your next sentence. A disagreement ends, and instead of replaying it throughout the evening, your attention naturally returns to the present. These victories are easy to overlook because they do not produce excitement. They produce stability. Modern life celebrates dramatic transformation, yet genuine inner change is usually quiet. It resembles a river gradually changing direction rather than a storm suddenly clearing the sky. The habits that once controlled you simply begin losing their influence, one small decision at a time. As this continues, your relationship with silence changes as well. There was a time when silence felt uncomfortable because it seemed like surrender. Remaining quiet during conflict almost appeared to confirm the accusations made against you. The mind insisted that immediate defense was necessary to protect your dignity. Gradually, you begin recognizing that many explanations exist only to satisfy the ego in the moment. Not every misunderstanding requires correction. Not every criticism deserves an answer. Not every opinion demands your participation. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, the best revenge is not to become like the one who caused the injury. This realization is deeply liberating because it removes an invisible burden you may have carried for years. The need to constantly prove yourself begins fading. The urge to control how every person perceives you quietly loses its grip. Curiosity slowly replaces judgment in situations that once produced instant outrage. Instead of immediately deciding that someone acted with bad intentions, you begin leaving room for possibilities your emotions would have ignored in the past. Perhaps they were overwhelmed. Perhaps they misunderstood. Perhaps they acted from fears you know nothing about. Even if none of those possibilities prove true, the willingness to consider them changes your own experience. Your peace no longer depends on immediately assigning blame. Curiosity creates space where certainty once lived. That space allows reason to remain active instead of becoming overwhelmed by emotional urgency. It becomes easier to understand without automatically agreeing, easier to listen without automatically surrendering, and easier to remain grounded while someone else struggles to do the same. Reflection gradually takes the place of retaliation. Before reacting, your attention naturally turns inward for a brief moment. You begin noticing what is happening inside yourself before deciding what should happen outside yourself. Is this response coming from wisdom or wounded pride? Is this conversation actually about the present moment, or has an older insecurity quietly joined it? Questions like these do not weaken your position. They strengthen it because they prevent temporary emotions from making permanent decisions. The pause you once had to consciously create slowly becomes part of your character. Others may see only your calm response, unaware of the countless internal habits that made such composure possible. An interesting shift begins taking place in your relationships. Difficult people still behave in difficult ways, but they no longer possess unlimited access to your emotional world. Their words may reach your ears without automatically reaching your identity. Their criticism may deserve consideration without becoming self-condemnation. Their approval becomes pleasant without becoming necessary. This subtle independence changes how others experience your presence. Conversations become less about defending yourself and more about understanding what is actually happening. You stop reacting to imagined threats that exist only inside interpretation. The energy once spent protecting your ego becomes available for listening, observing, and responding with greater clarity. This does not mean difficult days suddenly vanish. There will still be mornings when irritation appears before breakfast, afternoons when disappointment catches you off guard, and evenings when exhaustion makes patience feel unusually difficult. Emotional mastery has never meant perfection. It means recovering more quickly because awareness interrupts the old cycle before it grows stronger. A reaction that once consumed an entire week may now last only an hour. An argument that once damaged a relationship may now become an honest conversation. The emotion still arrives, but it no longer decides how the story ends. That quiet difference is far more significant than never becoming upset at all. Eventually, people notice something they cannot quite explain. They describe you as calm, grounded, or unusually difficult to provoke. They assume life has become easier for you, unaware that your circumstances remain much like everyone else's. The real change happened somewhere they could never observe. Your mind slowly stopped handing every external event permission to determine its condition. Approval no longer creates lasting pride. Criticism no longer creates lasting collapse, and conflict no longer automatically steals your peace. For the first time, emotional stability stops depending upon what happens around you and begins depending upon the discipline with which you meet each moment. That is where lasting freedom quietly begins, not because the world has finally learned to leave you alone, but because your inner world has learned that it no longer needs the world's permission to remain at peace. Eventually, people begin noticing something they cannot quite describe. They may never mention it directly, yet their behavior around you quietly changes. Conversations that once became arguments now settle more quickly. Those who once expected immediate emotional reactions seem almost surprised when they no longer receive them. Others begin speaking more honestly because they sense they are no longer dealing with someone ruled by impulse. Nothing dramatic has happened on the surface. You still laugh, still experience disappointment, still care deeply about the people in your life. The difference exists in the quiet spaces between events and reactions. You no longer appear rushed to defend yourself or anxious to convince everyone that you are right. There is a steadiness in your presence that did not exist before, and while others may struggle to explain it, they instinctively recognize it. One reason this change becomes noticeable is because the need to constantly prove yourself begins disappearing. Earlier in life, every disagreement may have felt like a judgment of your character. Every criticism carried the weight of personal rejection. Every misunderstanding seemed to demand immediate correction because silence felt too much like defeat. Gradually, that urgency begins fading. You realize that your worth was never dependent upon winning every conversation or changing every opinion. Some people will misunderstand you despite your best efforts. Others will criticize decisions they never fully understand. A few may continue disliking you no matter how carefully you explain yourself. Accepting these realities is not pessimism. It is freedom from an impossible task that was quietly exhausting your mind. This shift also changes your relationship with praise. Approval still feels pleasant because appreciation is part of being human. Recognition for honest effort remains meaningful. The difference is that praise no longer becomes the foundation of your identity. Earlier, compliments may have lifted your confidence only because criticism had the power to destroy it. Both approval and rejection controlled the emotional direction of your life because your sense of self depended upon how others responded to you. As Epictetus advised, if you seek to improve, be content to be thought foolish and foolish-looking concerning external things. As that dependence weakens, praise finds its proper place. It becomes something to appreciate without becoming something to chase. You stop measuring your value by the changing opinions of people whose perspectives naturally rise and fall with circumstances. Your confidence begins resting somewhere far more stable than public approval. The same transformation quietly affects criticism. Words that once lingered for days begin losing their ability to occupy your attention indefinitely. You still listen because useful feedback remains valuable regardless of how it is delivered. At the same time, unfair criticism no longer follows you into every quiet moment. The mind gradually learns to separate another person's opinion from objective reality. Someone else's frustration no longer automatically becomes evidence that you have failed. Another person's misunderstanding no longer demands endless explanation. You begin asking whether criticism contains something worth learning, rather than immediately deciding whether it threatens your identity. That simple change protects enormous amounts of emotional energy that was once spent fighting battles existing only inside your own thoughts. The Stoics understood that this quiet independence represented one of the highest forms of freedom available to a human being. They never imagined freedom as escaping responsibility or avoiding difficulty. Life continued presenting illness, disappointment, betrayal, uncertainty, and loss. None of those experiences disappeared simply because someone practiced philosophy. Freedom meant something far more practical. It meant carrying stability into unstable situations. It meant remaining capable of clear judgment while others surrendered to impulse. It meant refusing to allow temporary circumstances to permanently shape the condition of the mind. External events could still influence the day, but they no longer possessed unlimited authority over the person experiencing them. This creates a surprising sense of confidence that has very little to do with certainty. You stop needing guarantees before moving forward. Uncertainty becomes uncomfortable without becoming paralyzing. Mistakes remain disappointing without becoming permanent definitions of who you are. Failure still hurts, but it no longer convinces you that growth has ended. Confidence slowly shifts away from believing life will always unfold according to your plans. Instead, it grows from trusting your ability to meet whatever life eventually brings. That form of confidence cannot be taken away by criticism, rejection, or unexpected change, because it was never built upon those things in the first place. It was built upon the repeated experience of remaining present even when circumstances refused to cooperate. Looking back, the greatest realization often feels surprisingly simple. The world never truly possessed the authority you believed it held over your inner life. Other people influenced your thoughts only because your own interpretations quietly invited them to stay. Circumstances shaped your emotions only because your attention remained completely identified with each passing event. As perception became more disciplined, those invisible chains slowly weakened. Peace did not suddenly appear from somewhere outside yourself. It had been waiting beneath layers of habit, expectation, fear, and unconscious reaction all along. The journey was never about becoming emotionless or untouchable. It was about discovering that your deepest strength was never hidden inside controlling the world around you. It was quietly waiting inside your ability to govern the one place that had always belonged to you, your own mind. That is where lasting freedom begins, and once it is discovered, no passing insult, temporary setback, or changing opinion can ever fully take it away again. One final realization begins emerging after enough time has passed. You stop measuring progress by how calm you feel and begin measuring it by how quickly you return to yourself. There will still be days when frustration catches you off guard. Someone will eventually say exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment. Unexpected setbacks will still test your patience. Old habits may even resurface when life becomes especially difficult. None of this means you have failed. The Stoics never expected perfection because perfection is not part of the human condition. They expected awareness. Each time you recognize that your emotions are beginning to take control, each time you choose to pause instead of react, each time you replace assumption with observation, you strengthen something far more valuable than temporary emotional comfort. You strengthen your character. That quiet practice slowly changes the way you experience the world because your attention is no longer consumed by every passing irritation. Over time, this discipline extends beyond moments of conflict and quietly transforms ordinary life. You begin appreciating conversations instead of preparing your next defense while someone else is still speaking. Small inconveniences stop feeling like personal attacks. Delays become opportunities to practice patience rather than reasons to become restless. Even success begins feeling different because your confidence no longer depends on constant achievement or approval. You become more present with family because your mind is no longer replaying yesterday's argument. You become more attentive at work because unnecessary emotional battles stop draining your focus. Perhaps this is why the Stoics spoke so often about inner freedom. They understood that the greatest prison rarely has walls. It is built from habits of thought, repeated so often that they begin feeling like reality itself. The belief that every insult deserves a response. The belief that every criticism defines your worth. The belief that peace depends on other people behaving exactly as you hope they will. These invisible assumptions quietly shape an entire life until someone finally stops to question them. The moment you begin doing that, something remarkable happens. You realize that your greatest strength has never been your ability to control other people, predict the future, or avoid disappointment. It has always been your ability to govern your own mind in the middle of uncertainty. And once that becomes your daily practice, you carry with you something no circumstance can permanently take away. That is not merely emotional control, it is the beginning of genuine freedom. One final shift often goes unnoticed because it does not announce itself with dramatic breakthroughs or life-changing moments. Instead, it appears quietly in ordinary situations that once would have consumed your attention. Someone speaks harshly, and your first instinct is no longer to defend yourself, but to understand what is actually happening. A setback interrupts your plans, yet your mind no longer rushes toward the conclusion that everything is falling apart. Even uncertainty begins feeling different. It remains uncomfortable, but it no longer feels unbearable. The world has not become more predictable. It is your relationship with uncertainty that has changed. You begin trusting something that once seemed impossible to trust, your own ability to remain steady regardless of what happens next. This kind of confidence is easy to misunderstand because it does not look like confidence in the way people usually imagine it. It is not loud. It does not seek attention or depend on admiration. It rarely feels the need to convince anyone of its existence. Instead, it appears as quiet certainty. You stop measuring yourself against everyone around you because comparison gradually loses its purpose. Someone else's success no longer feels like your failure. Another person's opinion no longer determines your value. You begin recognizing that the need to constantly prove yourself was quietly creating the very insecurity you were trying to escape. Once that burden begins falling away, an unexpected sense of lightness replaces it. You spend less time protecting an image and more time becoming the person you hoped that image would represent. Perhaps this is why genuine inner discipline feels so different from simple self-control. Self-control often sounds like forcing yourself to resist temptation or suppress emotion through sheer effort. Inner discipline works differently. It changes the way you perceive the situation before the struggle becomes overwhelming. The temptation to react still appears, but it loses much of its influence because your understanding has changed. You no longer see every disagreement as a threat, every delay as an injustice, or every disappointment as evidence that life is working against you. Your perspective quietly transforms the experience before emotion has the chance to dominate it. What once required constant effort gradually becomes part of your character, and character always requires less energy than performance. As this way of living becomes more familiar, you also begin offering something valuable to the people around you without even trying. Calm has a quiet influence. Someone else's frustration no longer automatically becomes your frustration. Another person's anger no longer forces anger out of you in return. Your steadiness creates space where conversations can unfold differently. People often respond to the emotional atmosphere you bring into a room more than the words you choose. By refusing to add unnecessary hostility, you quietly reduce it. By remaining patient, you make patience possible for others. This is not because you control them, but because emotional balance has a way of inviting balance in return. Even when it does not change another person, it prevents their emotional state from becoming your own. Eventually, you stop asking whether life will ever become free from conflict because the question itself no longer matters. You understand that challenges were never the true obstacle. The greater challenge was learning how to meet them without losing yourself in the process. That realization changes the purpose of philosophy entirely. It is no longer something to admire, collect, or discuss. It becomes something to practice in conversations, disappointments, successes, failures, and countless ordinary moments that most people overlook. Wisdom reveals itself less through extraordinary achievements than through ordinary reactions repeated day after day. And perhaps that is the quiet truth the Stoics hoped people would discover. Lasting peace is not found at the end of a perfect life. It is built, moment by moment, by a mind that has finally learned where its true authority has always belonged. The world will continue testing your patience. People will still disappoint you. Plans will still change, and life will remain unpredictable. But none of those things have the final word unless you allow them to. Real freedom begins the moment you stop asking the world to protect your peace and start protecting it yourself. That quiet discipline is not something you achieve once. It is something you practice every single day, and with each choice, your mind becomes a place that fewer things can disturb.